In the mid-90s, video games were getting more realistic and more violent, so they became a target of blame as the rate of school shootings rose. There were a series of high-profile court cases about regulating violent video games from being accessible to young people, which still go on today. And in response to this public debate, comedian magicians Penn and Teller created their own video game titled Smoke and Mirrors, which was never publicly released but found its way onto the internet a decade later to become a cult classic. The game consists of several magic and prank-based minigames, but the one that still captivates players over 2 decades later was called Desert Bus. If politicians wish to regulate violence out of video games to focus on more realistic acts rather than the fantasies of violence, Penn and Teller developed Desert Bus to show what games would look like if they tried to recreate mundane reality and strip away action and violence.
Teller and I want to prepare you for the real world. We want to show you what life is really like. Desert Bus is the first in our line of what we like to call Vera simulators. Games stupefyingly like reality. 360 miles from Tucson, AZ to Las Vegas, NV. 45 miles per hour maximum. Teller! 8 hours if you do it right. Don't let go of the controller and watch that little pull to the right. It's not glamorous. It's not pretty. Not exciting. It's real.
The game is a real-time simulation of the 8-hour drive from Tucson to Las Vegas, consisting of nothing but keeping the bus on the empty road as the wheel turns slightly to the right. It is mind-numbingly boring, but has captivated players through the endurance test of scoring a single point through 8 hours of continuous play. But Penn and Teller weren't the only artists who examined the medium of video games during their discussion on their impact on the rise of violence. Gus Van Sant made his Death trilogy spanning from 2002 to 2005 in the wake of the Columbine massacre. The most direct reaction of these is the middle part of the trilogy, Elephant, which takes its name from the Alan Clark short about the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where Clark used minimal storytelling and long takes to capture the quiet, sudden, and inexplicable violence that flooded the news. Van Sant creates a polyphonic story that moves around a high school in the build-up to a horrific shooting, the camera seemingly searching for an answer for why this brutality occurs, but unable to decisively find one. In 2 moments, the film directly draws attention to the video game argument, once showing the shooters playing a violent video game in the lead-up to the massacre, and then during a montage flash-forward of the killings, the camera switches to a first-person perspective to match the look of those games. In this fictional video game, Elephant recalls its predecessor, Gerry. That film follows 2 men named Gerry as they try to find a way out of Death Valley, and Elephant's video game references the climax of Gerry, including the look of the 2 characters in this desert void and the Gerry count. But Van Sant's video game inspiration goes further. Both of these films spend most of their runtime quietly following characters walking from behind, mimicking the style of a third-person camera used in many video games. Van Sant himself acknowledged the video game comparison in a 2011 interview.
Yeah, the video game aspect is, including Gerry and Last Days, is coming from video games. Me playing video games was an effort for me to understand what was going on with the Columbine characters, because it was said that they had played video games, and so I didn't know what they were. Video games are often doing what we were doing in Gerry. To get from point A to point B, you have to actually travel there. You can't cut like in cinema. You cut to the new location. You actually walk, like in reality.
Desert Bus may be a joke about how dull reality is in contrast to the fantasy of video games, but it isn't really trying to capture reality either. This is what the stretch of road looks like in real life, and while it may be barren, it is a living, solid place. Unlike the rolling monotony of pixels that construct Desert Bus's landscape, every inch of the real place has been worn into its current shape over centuries, and modern games like the wildly popular Red Dead Redemption 2 find some magic in the real-time traversal of these imitations of living landscapes that are equally detailed but rendered by human hands and computers. YouTuber Jacob Geller explores the sense of artificial loneliness in his video essay on that game, and how its desert space on the edge of the map withholds the typical game-centered design to capture an emptiness.
I think there's ultimately a pretty obvious answer to why all these things create this feeling, at least for me. I'm the alive one. And of course I am. I never really had any pretense that these virtual worlds were real, but they're usually surface level engaging to an extent that I don't really have to stop and think about how I feel.
This is the same emptiness I find in the unreality of Desert Bus. It is a desert not as an ecosystem, but as a space of nihilism. It is death. Gus Van Sant's Gerry is a descent into the nihilistic desert. Its space becomes more empty as the character's situation becomes more desperate until it culminates in an act of violence in a white void. Just as its follow-up Elephant explores a seemingly meaningless violence through a camera that cannot find a reason for the brutality it builds to, Gerry stays concentrated on two figures walking further into their inevitable destruction so easily avoidable from the first wrong turn. The death of one of the Gerrys is a completely absurd loss, just as the desert itself is devoid of meaning in life. It recalls for me the movement of the theater of the absurd, which instead of following characters around as they wander a barren wasteland, usually confines them to a spot of waiting as we see in Samuel Beckett's Endgame in Waiting for Godot. In Godot, two vagabonds wait in a wasteland for a man named Godot who never appears, a cycle we see repeated in both acts. And in that empty waiting that fills the action of the play, the characters speak a kind of empty small talk that dilutes the very nature of language, one of the common themes of the theater of the absurd. Gerry and Elephant use very minimal dialogue, instead focusing on simply the act of movement for most of the film. But what dialogue is there is either very direct or difficult to parse. For example, one scene in Gerry drops us into a discussion about a strategy video game without naming it as a game, creating a strange epic speech about lost kingdoms without the context.
So then you didn't really...
Well, I had just conquered thieves, and then that happened.
In this collapse of language, both the theater of the absurd and the slow cinema of Gerry find an abstract expression of extreme emotion through silent waiting. Philippe Carrel's 1972 film The Inner Scar uses the empty desert space to capture similarly extreme emotions, but aided by the haunting wail of Nico's voice. While Gerry offers us an entrance into the inexplicable desert, The Inner Scar simply places us into its vastness, and only gives us long abstract visual sequences to capture a raw emotion of suffering. The emptiness of its desert is the emotion. But as the film goes on, its abstract visuals create an epic fantasy story, not an easy one to understand, but one which recalls the recognizable symbols of an epic quest. It is abstracted, but as its long, slow shots go on, I found my mind wandering to more mainstream films that may exist in similar desert spaces. One of the most popular films of all time begins its narrative with two inhuman figures wandering through an alien desert. Its science fiction framing both justifying its desert space while also adding a layer of abstraction from reality. More recently, two young men embark on an epic quest across a monstrous desert corrupted by absolute evil that grows darker as they approach their goal. And the same video game-inspired cinematic language used by Gus Van Sant achieved an Oscar win with 1917, which used the extreme long take to track a journey across no man's land. But these films don't fit the ideal of the nihilistic desert because they are centered on quests of meaning, rather than the embrace of pure, often frustrating emotion. And I think the ideal of slow cinema, also embodied in Desert Bus, is the willingness to let an audience sit in emptiness and delve into themselves. It's asking a lot of an audience, and while we may wish more films to take such risks and challenge the medium, one may also ask what the appeal even is. I can't speak for anyone else, but I find something really relatable about the expansive isolation of these spaces, while I am trapped in an enclosed isolation. The pandemic has made it hard to focus on things for a long time, and while I've kept up with most of my movie viewing, I don't think I'm as patient a viewer as I was before the world fell apart. So these works that demand contemplation and stillness as the only way to engage, but also invite the mind to wander into them, are refreshing and maybe needed. But perhaps they also offer a solace from overbearing meaning. When I play Desert Bus, there is only the open road, and I need not consider the libertarian politics of Penn and Teller, even as they directly relate to the reason of its origin, or the child pornography allegations against Randy Pitchford, who helped develop the VR remake I've played. When I watch Gerry, I can simply focus on the giant white void, and not Van Sant's involvement in the rise of Harvey Weinstein with his film Good Will Hunting, which shared both of the film's stars, or the sexual harassment allegations against star Casey Affleck. And I don't have to think about Nico's violent racism when I hear her beautiful wailing in the soundtrack of The Inner Scar. The nihilistic desert is an escape from meaning and reality in favor of a liminal space of isolation, and maybe that's what we need right now. But I think soon we have to come out of the desert and face the real, living, flawed world. A world not of isolation, but of people just as real and living and flawed and beautiful in all of those things.